Picture this. You're a brutal, absolute dictator ruling over most of Europe in 1942. You send a massive, fawning, incredibly self-important birthday telegram to a captive king, fully expecting some groveling gratitude in return. Instead, the king shoots back a response so unbelievably short and so devastatingly bland that it literally breaks an entire country's police force and changes the course of a war. I mean, it sounds like the setup to a ridiculous joke, right? But this actually happened.
Okay, let's unpack this. The dictator here was Adolf Hitler, and the king was Christian X of Denmark. Hitler had just sent this massive, glowing 70-second birthday message to the king, and the king's complete, unedited reply was just 4 words: Spreche mein besten Danken aus, which translates to many thanks. That's it. That's the whole message. It is the 1940s diplomatic equivalent of replying to a 10-paragraph, emotionally charged text message with a simple thumbs-up emoji.
Well, those 4 little words caused absolute, undeniable chaos. Hitler threw a complete tantrum. He was utterly furious at this polite little brush-off. Up until this moment, which historians literally call the telegram crisis, the German occupation of Denmark had been remarkably, if uneasily, peaceful. But Hitler's meltdown over this perceived insult totally shattered that truce. He used it as an excuse to clean house, bringing in a notorious hardliner named Dr. Werner Best to brutally tighten the screws on the whole nation.
Now, to understand why Hitler's reaction was such a massive shock to the system, we kind of have to rewind to April 1940. When Germany originally invaded, the Danish government surrendered almost immediately. Why? To avoid a total bloodbath. They agreed to keep producing food, like the cattle you see being loaded onto German ships right here, and to export it to Germany. In exchange, the Danish king and his government were allowed to stay in power. They essentially became this really uneasy model protectorate for the Nazis, a conquered nation that was still officially running itself. But here's where things get really messy. This weird compromise trapped one specific group of people in an impossible nightmare: the Danish police force. We're talking about 10,000 guys who were expected to just clock in and operate normally while a hostile foreign army occupied their streets. The Gestapo constantly demanded that these local cops crack down on their own citizens and protect German interests. But, these were Danish cops. They secretly harbored deep sympathies for the growing underground resistance. They were caught dead in the middle, desperately trying to appease a brutal occupier while secretly trying to shield their own people. So after the King's Telegram incident, and as the wider war started turning against Germany, that polite, cooperative facade, it completely crumbled. The Danish resistance exploded into action. Citizens weren't just passively protesting anymore, they were derailing trains, blowing things up, and making life absolutely miserable for the German military. You even had the British Special Operations Executive parachuting in weapons and explosives in the dead of night. The uneasy truce was officially dead and buried. And this all boils over into pure, unadulterated chaos by the summer of 1944. In June, resistance fighters actually managed to blow up a major arms factory right in Copenhagen. And before they blew it up, they walked out with a massive stash of automatic weapons. The Germans panicked. They declared a civil state of emergency and started executing resistance fighters. The Danish public fought back with a massive general strike, which got incredibly bloody. 92 Danes were shot dead in the streets. And through all this violence, the Gestapo is screaming at the Danish police to crush the strikes. But the police? They basically just stood by and folded their arms. They effectively refused to fight their own neighbors. And let me tell you, the Nazis did not forgive that kind of defiance. On September 19th, 1944, under the codename Operation Möwe, the German military made their move. But they didn't just go after the resistance, they went after the cops. In a single, highly coordinated sweep across all the main cities, the Gestapo rounded up 1,960 Danish police officers, almost a fifth of the entire national force, totally disarmed and thrown into trucks in a matter of hours. Now, it's really easy to get completely lost in a big, abstract number like 1,900. So let's zoom all the way in on exactly who is getting caught up in this dragnet. Take this guy, John O. Frederickson. He wasn't some high-ranking general or a master spy. He was a 27-year-old reserve police constable walking a beat in Copenhagen. He was married. He literally had a baby daughter born that very same year. And just for showing up to work and refusing to betray his community, he suddenly had a massive Gestapo target on his back. Frederickson's descent into the Nazi camp system was terrifyingly fast. Look at this timeline. On September 19th, he's arrested. Just 2 days later, he's processed as a police prisoner inside the brutal Neuengamme concentration camp. 8 days after that, they pack him onto a transport train to the infamous Buchenwald camp. By October 3rd, literally just 2 weeks after kissing his wife and newborn baby goodbye in Copenhagen, he is lying in a freezing camp hospital suffering from pneumonia. His entire normal life was dismantled in 14 days. But incredibly, physical proof of this nightmare actually survived. Fredrickson kept these items, and his family has preserved them to this day. Inside those wires, he wasn't John anymore. He was prisoner number 86005, marked with a red triangle and a D to brand him as a Danish political prisoner. We still have his stamped metal ID tag. He even kept a 1 Reichsmark canteen token, specifically stamped for the SS canteen at Buchenwald. Having these incredible, tangible artifacts right in front of us, it just makes the cold, terrifying bureaucracy of the Holocaust absolutely undeniable. And the day-to-day reality inside those camps was a desperate battle just to stay alive. Fredrickson himself spent 7 miserable weeks in the hospital with pleural pneumonia. Honestly, he was lucky to survive it, because during that brutal winter of '44, the cramped, freezing, unsanitary conditions triggered a massive epidemic of scarlet fever. 60 Danish policemen died from the disease. Just think about that. These were regular civil servants, ripped off their hometown streets, dying of a fever on wooden bunks hundreds of miles away from everything they knew. But back home, the Danish government had not forgotten their boys. In a really remarkable diplomatic flex, Danish officials constantly hammered the German authorities, demanding the right to send Red Cross food parcels to their captive cops. And miraculously, it worked. This sketch right here, it was actually drawn in 1948 by a Danish survivor, and it perfectly captures this surreal, heartbreaking reality. You see a Danish prisoner opening a Red Cross box from home, while a crowd of starving Russian and Polish inmates gathers around just to stare at the food. Those parcels are the single biggest reasons so many of the Danish police managed to survive that winter. But as 1944 dragged into 1945, a huge new problem started to emerge. The Allied forces were closing in from all sides. The Nazi Empire was completely collapsing in on itself, and as it did, it became more desperate, more chaotic, and way more deadly. The Danish authorities realized that simply sending cheese and crackers wasn't going to cut it anymore. If they didn't figure out a way to get their policemen physically out of Germany before the final collapse, they might all be killed in the crossfire, or worse, executed by the SS in a final act of spite. Which brings us to an absolutely crucial, life-saving bureaucratic miracle. In December 1944, after relentless political pressure, the Danish administration secured a jaw-dropping agreement. Over 1,600 of their surviving policemen were officially transferred out of the concentration camp system and moved to Stalag 4B. Why is that a big deal? Because they were officially upgraded to prisoners of war. POWs actually had some degree of protection under international conventions, whereas concentration camp inmates had literally zero. Just by changing a few words on a piece of paper, they massively increased these men's odds of living to see the end of the war. Finally, by the spring of 1945, the rescue op is a go, and it is wild. Swedish Count Folke Bernadotte orchestrated this insanely daring mission known as the White Buses. Imagine this. Neutral, Swedish logistical units painted their buses entirely white with massive red crosses on the roofs so Allied bombers wouldn't blow them up, and then they drove straight into the heart of a collapsing, burning Nazi Germany. It was wildly dangerous. One convoy even got mistakenly strafed by the Royal Air Force, but somehow they pulled it off. They evacuated thousands of Scandinavian prisoners, including the vast majority of our Danish cops, getting them out of the camps and safely into neutral Sweden, just weeks before Germany finally surrendered. So, the policemen make it out, thank God. Denmark is officially liberated on May 5th, 1945. But the nation wakes up the very next morning to a deeply ironic problem. Their entire military had been totally disarmed and dissolved by the Germans back in '43. So when Liberation Day hit, the official Danish army had exactly 0 regular armed forces. 0. Sure, they had about 40,000 underground resistance fighters running around with smuggled pistols and a single brigade that had been training in Sweden, but as a sovereign professional military force, they were literally starting from scratch. And trying to rebuild a modern army from nothing results in some pretty hilarious bureaucratic desperation. They essentially had to arm their new recruits with whatever they could scrape out of the couch cushions of Europe. Check out these actual inventory numbers. You got over 12,000 Swedish rifles, perfectly mixed with 15,000 British ones. They had Swedish 37mm anti-tank guns over here, but British 57mm ones over there.
The official records even explicitly complain that the 4,000 British Sten guns they received were in very poor shape. It was a total nightmare for any supply officer, basically duct taping a national defense back together with international hand-me-downs. But you know what? They did it. They rebuilt. And as the occupation finally ended, the Danish Freedom Council issued this directive to the underground army, which perfectly brings this whole incredible story full circle. They wrote, "It will be your task to guard people, as you were meant to." And that right there, that was exactly what those 1,960 Danish policemen had tried to do all along. They paid for that choice with concentration camps, sickness, and for some, their lives. And it leaves us with a really provocative question to think about. When the institutions of power are corrupted by a hostile force, what is the true cost of a civil servant simply refusing to turn against their own people?